Before we begin, and as now is our practice, I would like to acknowledge those who came before us and whose stories may not be widely known. At the Old North Foundation, we continuously strive to deepen our knowledge of the past and to share our history with honesty and respect for those who came before us. Old North site was once the traditional territory of the Massachusetts people. When Old North Church was founded in 1723, the Massachusetts communities in the area had already been decimated by disease, trafficked into enslavement, removed from their homes, and forced to assimilate into European culture. Despite this devastating reality, the Massachusetts people survived, and their descendants carry on the knowledge and traditions of their ancestors. Their story is part of our shared American story. Thank you all for your interest in programming like tonight's speaker series event with Dr. Salim Washington. This season, we continue to explore lesser known parts of our shared history. Tonight, we begin a 3-part arc devoted to David Walker, a 19th century Black abolitionist. Walker is best known for his pamphlet, which is called An Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World, which was published in Boston in 1829. The appeal passionately called upon the Black community to rise up against the institution of slavery and demand, and if necessary, seize their birthright of freedom and dignity. Walker's too short life is an example of one type of active citizenship and demonstrates the power of the written word to create change. Next month, we will look more closely at the language of the appeal with artist and educator Lamerchi Frazier and playwright Peter Snowd. Their conversation will explore the power of the text. We hope you'll join us on December 15th, and we thank Citizens Bank for supporting this season's speaker series. And now, let me introduce our speaker. Dr. Salim Washington is a musician, activist, and scholar. Born in Tennessee, Dr. Washington grew up largely in Detroit, where he began to play his musical instrument. He came east to attend Harvard, where he ultimately earned a PhD. And during his time in the Boston area, he was a community activist as well as a musician. Dr. Washington is a professor of music at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa and is currently a visiting professor at Columbia University. I have to say his life story is fascinating, and I truly urge you to visit his website to learn more about it. So tonight's speaker series event will be a little bit different from previous ones in that we will invite you at points during the talk to join in the conversation and to ask your questions then. So you don't have to necessarily hold all your questions till the very end, but just wait until Dr. Washington opens it up for conversation. Once again, please keep yourselves on mute if you're not involved in the conversation, and I urge you, put yourself on speaker view so you can more closely follow the conversation. And so now I'm going to hand it off to our speaker and sit back and relax and enjoy this talk.
Thank you so much, Catherine. I really appreciate this opportunity to speak to you, and to speak with you about David Walker. I have to say that I was very surprised when I was first approached with the idea of giving this talk, not because I don't share the enthusiasm for understanding his importance and his relevance in our history and in our present time as well, I think. But because even though I studied African American studies and African and American studies quite formally, not one person had ever assigned the appeal. Not one class required that we discuss anything about David Walker, which is very ironic to say the least. So I'm thrilled that we have this opportunity to look into this man. David Walker. Um, there are we have an idea about his biography, primarily through his own words in the appeal, also in a short biography that Henry Garnett did on the third reprint of the appeal. But scholars who are scouring for the documents to show when and where and how exactly disagree about very important kind of biographical facts, starting with his birth. Some Garnett said that he was born in 1795, but I think the consensus is that it's probably more like, I'm sorry, 1785, but the consensus is that it's something like 1796 or 1797. We know his death of 1830 and that he was probably 43, not 34, as has been also entered into the historical record. I think that um, the things that are most important about Walker and his appeal is the notion of uplift, the notion of social and psychological uplift of African American people. Also, I think it's important to understand his rhetoric in the same ways that we understand the rhetoric of, say, Thomas Paine's common sense, in that it is something that is supposed to incite into the imagination of the perceived audience to begin to see themselves differently, to begin to understand their context differently. So this was a very ambitious kind of writing. Um, First of all, it's an appeal. It's not a request. This is not written to black people in the hopes that white people will overhear it. This is not written to appeal to the largesse of philanthropists. It's not written even for the comrades, the white comrades who were abolitionists. This is actually written to, as he calls it, the colored people, the citizens of the world, which is interesting because he's already invoking what we now call the Black Atlantic, which was something that didn't begin when it was theorized, but throughout the history of the so-called New World. So the notion of citizenship is something that is shaped in this debate with the notion of expatriation uh, or just deportation, even. So these are ideas that are being lived out as well as being discussed at the time of David Walker. So I think I would like to talk about him in the series of various series of context. Okay, so the first context that I'd like to consider him is in his community in the time period that he came up in. It would be a mistake to think that the appeal was written in a time of general unrest on the part of the American slaves. In fact, it's really one of the crowning documents of a period of our history that was rife with armed conflict between slaves and slave owners, if you will. In 1800, we have Gabriel Prosser's conspiracy in Richmond, Virginia. Then in Charleston, South Carolina, in 1822, we have Denmark Vesey's conspiracy. And then a year after the death of David Walker, we have Nat Turner's, not conspiracy, but his revolt in 1831 in Southampton, Virginia. So it is uh, probably more remarkable, the last one, for Nat Turner, because Gabriel Prosser and Denmark Vesey and David Walker all have in common that they were free men, whereas Nat Turner was actually a slave and did not just conspire, but actually enacted a revolt, an attempt at revolution. It was not as well thought out or as ideologically buttressed as was that of Vesey or Gabriel's conspiracy, but it does stand as a historical kind of anomaly in a way. Um, and the other context to consider is that all of these revolts are happening on the eastern seaboard of the South, right? So sailors are very important because of their mobility, and so are the boat oarsmen because of the agricultural products being transported on the rivers. So we know that this is something that people thought about because there was a crackdown in the same time period on sailors, and there were many extra legal kind of reprisals against black folk. But uh, if in fact he's born in the 1790s in Wilmington, then David Walker would have witnessed these outliers who were marauding against slave plantations, as well as have known about the Maroons who lived in the swamps and other inaccessible parts. Um, so he would have been around self-possessed black leaders, especially those that were associated with the church, because you have the African Baptist Church, you have the proximity of the Second Great Awakening, and so forth. So I think that we need to think about David Walker and his contribution in the way that we think of 20th century leaders like Marcus Garvey and then later Malcolm X. I think um, a look at his associations, his pronouncements, and an analysis of his pamphlet will reveal that there are similarities, though, of course, there are historical differences as well. So, the context of the political economy in which Walker grew up could be called, uh, for antebellum time period, a period of relative black power. Um, by 1790, in Wilmington, blacks are the numerical majority. They are not only the numerical majority, they are the skilled labor force. Um, they were in the lumber industry, they were in the shipping industry, they did the work for the naval industry, they were ship pilots in the dangerous river ports, they transported the food, and so forth. And so not only did they have this kind of presence with skills and presence in terms of their mobility relative to other slaves, they also had more leisure time. Some of those that were not involved in these industries were in the growing rice, which meant that they did have more leisure time. And they were known to have fabulous gardens, and they had foods. Now, um, in this case, they were actually sometimes better off physically, nutritionally, than poor whites were. And because of the shortage of agricultural industry due to the shipping industry and the naval industry, the food supplies from these gardens were sold in the market and were an important part of the food supply of the region. So these people are, uh, in some sense of the word, having some power and some degree of autonomy. Okay. And so they added to this even further by the fact that many of these market men, many of these yield men were also able to hire out their labor and to get money and to create this industry around the marketplace that they were so integral to. So you find that while they are slaves, they are also yeomen and also kind of like a proto-proletariat in a sense. So this is a kind of heady mix, sociologically and economically speaking. And this is something that as a free black, David Walker could see because he's still tied to this slave community, but he has the vantage point of being involved in a very conspicuous way in the economy and the social organization of Wilmington. Um, Maybe I'll stop there and see if we're all on the same page.
We do have a question. One
Okay.
person, yeah, asked, they said, I've read that Walker attended the same Charleston church as Vesey. Did Vesey influence Walker's views or vice versa?
I think uh, the first formulation is correct. Vesey influenced Walker. The language uh, that is attributed to Vesey is very similar to the language of the appeal. And the fact that it was, that they had ideological kind of similarities. Number one, that um, black people were humans. Uh, Number two, that God loved black people. Number three, that the Bible supports the freedom of black people and the eradication of slavery. So all of these things, sorry. Oh, so all of these things indicate that he was influenced by Vesey, and it's thought that he probably uh, might have even been a part of that conspiracy. He leaves after the trial of Vesey. He and other people, they were all involved in the African church, the Wilmington African Church, and they also looked at the point of view of black conditions under slavery through what you could call a class analysis. So the class analysis that Vesey uses and that we later see in the appeal is not economic. Um, it's not like Malcolm X's house slave versus field slave. It's ideological. It's ideological. And so, how to explain this? This is a common misperception when we are evaluating the efficacy of these antebellum workers and even those who go into the early of 20th century. W.B. Du Bois says famously, after 10 or 20 years of the NAACP, that we have managed to achieve less than nothing. Um, and then people are even more vicious against Marcus Garvey, and of course, more vicious again against David Walker in terms of discussing the efficacy of their work. And this is a mistake, I think, because what people don't realize is the degree of psychological trauma that the slaves suffered from. And this is something that was not only noticed, but a primary focus of his rhetoric is on not uplift in terms of temperacy and behaving like good bourgeois folk, but uplift in the sense of rejecting the image of you that's been propagated through your slave masters and through white institutions and through white society, but rather with the help of black churches, which eventually become independent, that you can begin to see yourself as worthy of the same things that all men and women are worthy of. In short, that you are part of the human family. You are not this chattel only. Uh, and that seems like something that's so basic and something that maybe you might even think it could be assumed. But that would be because uh, we don't fully contemplate the reach of the kind of theological, political, and social rhetoric of all those who are in power against you, especially if you are born into servitude and are being taught that this is, according to the Bible, according to the normative kind of morality of the day, something that's ordained by God. And so Vesey is saying not only are we ordained as men, uh, we have a right to use violence to fight for our freedom. We have a right to destroy the people who are holding us in contempt and who are holding us in bondage. And something else that we see that becomes even more poignant in its use by someone like Elijah Muhammad, he refers to the slave owners and slave catchers as devils, right? So here he inverts the kind of ontology, the ontological assumptions that people make about the nature of Black people, about the nature of African culture as being barbaric, as the people being subhuman, being on the bottom of the great chain of being, and so forth. So these are ideas that we see in Vesey, in the transcripts of the trials of Vesey, and then we see them later in the appeal. So I guess one of the main things I'm trying to say with this um, look at these various contexts is that it's not that the appeal influenced the rebels of the day. It's rather that Walker was influenced by the rebels of the day, and a unique set of circumstances conspired such that he was able to write one of the most important documents of that day.
So if after the trials were very traumatic within the greater community, and also, of course, Vesey's followers, there were many executions. It was a terrifying time. Is that about when Walker came to Boston? Could you talk about how he got to Boston and how he settled in? Because he seems to have attained some degree of presence in the city pretty quickly.
Yes, you're right. Excellent question. It's his um, exact time and whereabouts are not known with 100% certainty. So, by looking at what he himself says, what Garnett says, and what is likely given the circumstances, we believe that he went to Philadelphia first, where there were 10,000 free Black people, and where work was plentiful. And prior to that, we believe that he was in Charleston first. I mean, Wilmington first, Charleston next, perhaps some other place in the South or West, but eventually in Philadelphia, and then to Boston. So when he gets to Boston, he's already a member of the Methodists, um, the African Methodist Episcopal Church. He joins Prince Hall Mason Masonic Lodge. He comes in with a skill, and he works as a skilled tradesman, as a tailor and a seller of used clothes, which was a recognized kind of profession at that time. Um, and through his associations, uh, through the church and through the Masonic Lodge, he's introduced into Black Boston elite society. He marries into an elite family that had been free for 2 generations. Um, and so this plus his political kind of orientation made him have a rather elevated social standing within Black Boston very quickly.
So he also, when you read the appeal, his his breadth of reading is staggering. He is using references to not only Old Testament, New Testament, to current biblical or religious scholars, to ministers and their sermons, but he's referring to history, ancient history, classical history. And he emphasizes the importance of education so often in the appeal. Could you talk a little bit more about what might be known about Walker's background and where he was educated, or was he an autodidact?
Well, this is really not known. What is conjectured is that he learned it through the Quakers, the Presbyterians, the Baptists, the Methodists. In other words, the Great Awakening was a subversive kind of um, presence in the American South because it was multiracial. Uh, Perhaps to say it was integrated would be too strong. Um, but compared to everything else that existed at that time, maybe it's not too strong to say that it was integrated. Um, so you did have people, especially in the Quakers and the Baptists, who believed in teaching, reading, writing. Um, he has the zeal of an autodidact because one of the central tenets of his appeal is that we must, is almost like a talented tenth that we would hear from Du Bois decades later, that we need to make sure that we are educated, that we are literate, and that we form alliances amongst ourselves. And then there's the important um, kind of political sharpening of this elitism in a way because it's not for the sake of the betterment of the black bourgeoisie. This is never his focus, as would often be the case in later decades with black leaders. Actually, what he is saying is if you can read, then you must read this out loud to someone who cannot read, right? And they even had communal readings where an entire congregation would sit there and hear the words of the appeal. So his audience is clearly the masses of black folk, not the elite of black folk, even though somewhat paradoxically, this is to be disseminated through the skills that the black elite had, and also the elite in the sense of being mobile, because he had to disseminate this, and he did. It shows up in New Orleans, it shows up in Charleston, it shows up in Wilmington. It's, there are trials for people for having it, right? So the sailors and the riverboat men and the preachers are very instrumental in his plan and his strategy for disseminating it.
So he's written this incredibly powerful, very challenging work. And he goes right to the jugular, and it's like, you have to take back your freedom. You are men, you have this right, it is innate. So what's the reaction among the Black community, but also how was this received by the white community?
Okay. Amongst the black community, um, you have a number of strategies. Um, Not all black leaders were as radical as David Walker. Um, David Walker, you have to realize, is not a reformist, he's a revolutionary. Um, and so, in a way, um, just like we don't, okay, the French Revolution, this is happening right after the American Revolution, right? And the rhetoric of the American Revolution finds its way into these uprisings, right? Which some of them held elections, some of them had talk about equality and so forth. Um, and so the French Revolution and the American Revolution are studied together. But the revolution that happens in the same time period that goes further is the Haitian Revolution, or what they would have called the Saint Domingue, right? So these three revolutions should be discussed together, right? But somehow the one that is the most far-reaching in the tenets of freedom and democracy is the very one that is discredited, right? I mean, the Haitians are the only people to free themselves from slavery, and they have never been forgiven for that. To this very day, we find ways to vilify them, to victimize them. It's my theory that it goes back to 1791 to 1804. So these uprisings that are happening along the sea coast with the Maroons and the outliers, including the theorists, people like Vesey, people like David Walker, um, they stand at the vanguard of this type of revolutionary process of thinking and organizing and planning. And so you have people who are not ready for that. In every revolution, you have people who are like, this is too far out. What do you mean we have to kill somebody? Right? We can't do that. And then you have those who are ready to go, who have very little to lose, who understand what you're saying, they're ready to go. And so you see in the black community both of these. You also see the strategy of, as Paul Lawrence Dunbar says, we wear the mask that grins and lies, right? So if you're caught with 30 copies of the appeal and the police, they hand you over and you stand in front of the judge, you don't say, I'm striking a blow for black revolution. What you say is, this white man gave me these things and he told me to deliver them, and I'm just following orders. So the official record is somewhat muddied by this kind of strategic answer that people were forced to give. But surely there were so many uprisings in the 1820s, in 1829, in 1830, in 1831, the years uh, preceding, during, and directly after the presence of the appeal is known and known to have been read communally, you find that there are people out there who are uprising, who are taking it as far as they possibly can, right? So, but what I'm trying to suggest is, it's not that he incited this. This was happening before he was born. And he grew up in an environment where this was very much something happening. And we can look at the newspaper media reports. We can look at the kind of things people are saying, the type of laws that are being passed, that this was a concern for white people and a particular concern for white slave owners because they understood very, very well the magnitude of the threat against them, right? And so I would say that the appeal is part of a revolutionary time when there was an unusual amount of anti-slave revolt, of people saying, this is it, this is it. We will not be slaves anymore. Not only are they saying that on a personal level, like Nat Turner, who just goes off one day, right? He just goes on a rampage. He can't take it. You have people who were planning not just for their freedom, but attacks against the institution of slavery itself, attacks against the state apparatus that supported the institution. So with Gabriel's conspiracy and Denmark Vesey's especially, we see this. And this is happening because of the economic independence, the mobility, that we talked a little bit about the fact that sailors are moving around. In the civil rights movement, or when they during the Great Migration, it was done by Pullman porters, right? Black men who worked as servants, but who had more mobility than people, and they were taken to the Chicago Defender, for instance, from locale to locale. And so you have something similar in the 1820s, I think. So I think his idea was was accepted. It was being acted on, or maybe the correct way of saying it is he had the clarity and the boldness to make these proclaimers because people were already enacting it around him, and he was aware of it. White people, of course, were scared. They were frightened. They were alarmed because this is well, obviously on one level because of the physical danger, the physical peril that they might be in, and equally obvious is for the economic kind of loss that they would incur through slaves freeing themselves or slaves running away. Right, for them this is property, this is investment, and they're losing it. But even more than that is that he is having the temerity to say that God is on his side, that he's not only human in a way that society is insisting he is not, but he is a favored human. He's a Christian in the sense that Christianity favors the downtrodden. As an ideology, Christianity promises that the humble and the meek shall be rewarded, right? That they have special favor with God. And so you have David Walker saying, we have special favor, right? There's the famous story in the one of the things that struck me the most when I first read the appeal, and it never left me, was the story about the car full of slaves that were being led down south, and they managed to get free, and they kill some, but they left one man for dead without making sure he was dead. Um, and so, of course, he goes, he gets help, and they come and they recapture the slaves. And so his he doesn't sound like Frederick Douglass. He doesn't sound like Barton Delaney. He says you should have killed him. That if it was the other way around, they would have made sure that you were dead, right? So this is a stupid mistake. You know, this is a stupid mistake. So the first thing about no snitching, you know, we see it as early as the appeal. Like we should kill people who would turn us in. They're like, these people don't deserve to live. And the devils that's doing this to us, they don't deserve to live either. We must take it, right? So this is crazy talk. Even in 2021, that would be considered crazy talk, right? So in 1829, this is beyond belief. It's beyond belief. So for me, that is the strongest thing about the appeal, and probably the most damaging to the psyche of those who want to ensure that white supremacy becomes remains the law of the land. It's interesting, you know, I'm reminded of the other person who's not in this grand list of Denmark Vesey and Nat Turner and Gabriel Prosser, of course, would be Harriet Tubman, right? Had she been a man, we would know a lot more about her, I'm sure. But Harriet Tubman says, I freed, oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't turn this on. I freed 1,000 slaves, and I could have freed 1,000 more if they had only known that they were slaves, right? Which seems almost like a fantastic statement to make. But I think with a little historical imagination, we can imagine how that could be the case. It's not like you are inoculated against the worst of racial prejudice, you know, by your avuncular, you know, grandfather teaching you, and by you reading and turning on the internet and finding out what the truth and the alternative theories are. You are subjected to a pretty totalizing type of worldview. And so this is an amazing document. And it's okay. See, I'm going against my own theory here. It is an amazing document, but it's an amazing time period, a very kind of fertile time period, uh, which allowed his imagination to go in that way, which allowed his organization to go in that way. So I think white people hate him. And I think the fact that I can go to one of the leading uh, places of study of African American culture and never once have a conversation about David Walker is telling. That's telling, right? Because I was asked to read Moby Dick 5 times. I was asked to read, Life of a Slave, but maybe 2 or 3 times. Even the mention of David Walker never happened. So I want to say that the reaction of whites and some blacks against the appeal is ongoing. It's ongoing. Why is it that we don't study it as one of the great antebellum documents? Why is it we don't discuss it as a great humanitarian incitement? There's always sort of a question mark around it. I don't know. Well, I guess I'm gonna have to stop saying that because here I am talking to you about it. Yeah.
So you had said that Walker had found himself a position among uh, the elite of his community when he moved to Boston and married into a family that was very established there. And I think one thing that is important maybe to tease out a little bit is that the community of abolitionists had very varying attitudes on what the best way or what the best approach was to accomplish abolition, and then what would happen afterward. So there was a whole spectrum of ideas and suggestions and theories and plans going on. When Walker wrote the appeal, did he join the most violent of that spectrum, and did he lose his position within the community because of that, or was that embraced?
Um, he did not lose face in his community. He was very well thought of and fondly thought of. Uh, he was not ostracized or anything like this. And again, remember, black people wear the mask that grins and lies, right? So, not too long after this, we would get this very poem by Paul Laurence Dunbar, and not for nothing. So, it's not that he joined the most violent. Ah, I don't believe that Walker saw his rhetoric as violent. I think he saw his predicament as violent, that violence was being pressed against black people. And even though he, being a free black, had a less severe and totalizing experience with violence, he was not exempt from it, number one. And number two, he realized that his fate, in part, was tied to the fate of those others who were in the more severe and totalizing experience of violence. So I don't think he wanted violence or that he was a violent person or that his theoretical views were about violence. I think what he was saying was, we are humans. And so he lives in a time and in a country that just had a revolution, right? And no one is casting aspersions against George Washington because he was violent. They're looking at George Washington as a hero who won the freedom of his people. And so David Walker is saying, are we not men? Are we not deserving of freedom? Like, what makes it okay for some people to be free and not us? Why not us? That is his focus, not on violence, but on the despicable oppression that black people were under, right? And so this is something that, as 21st century historians, of course, we know this story backwards and forwards, but everybody didn't know it backwards and forwards then in the same way that we do, because the assumption was not always that these people are men, these people are women. That was not the prevailing presumption, right? And so those of us who think more than superficially about racism, we realize that there's no one who's free from it, right? Um, it's the people that tell you, "Oh man, there's nothing racist about me." Those are the people that you have to watch carefully, right? Because they're not in touch with the reality about themselves. If I, as a black man who has nothing to gain from racist thoughts, cannot be completely free of them, then how does anyone else manage to be completely free of them? Please tell me so that I can heal myself more completely. And so this is what Walker is dealing with. So I think some people say we don't want freedom because it costs too much. We must be patient and wait our turn. There are always going to be people like that. I'm sure there were United States colonists who wanted to side with Britain, who were not ready to take up arms, right? But history doesn't concern itself with them as much as it does with the spectacular victory that was made, right, by these young Scrabble guys who learned from the Indians that they had committed were committing genocide against, how to fight, So um, history is a funny thing that way. It's a funny thing that way. So I want you to reframe the question. I guess I'm saying that it's not that he was violent. It's not that he was violent. These people that he said that should have killed the slave masters, they were being dragged around in chains to go to God knows what type of future, right? People who were ready to defend their right to do so to the pain of death. So when he says, I have a right to be free, even if it means I have to kill you, why is he the violent one? What? I think he would frame the question more like that. You know, I think. Yeah, I mean, tell me what you think, because I could be wrong. I could be wrong.
Well, I think you've shifted my perspective, so thank you. This is this is a great question. Is the cause of David Walker's death still a question for you? Natural or inflicted, consumption or poisoning?
You,
So maybe we should first tell people what the controversy is about his death.
yes. So a year after he writes the appeal, and after it is found traveling throughout the country, and after there are numerous violent uprisings that are happening in tandem with it, um, he is vilified. He's persona non grata with the powers that be, and then he dies, and it's suspected initially that he was poisoned. Uh, and then I think the historical record is now saying he had tuberculosis, or as they would have said then, consumption, and that he died of that. And people did die of consumption in the 19th century. So it is not preposterous on the face of it. Uh, for me, though, you're asking me as a historian or as a human being? Um, I guess both, eh? So I would say, as a historian, we have to say we don't know. We have to say we don't know. As a person who's been alive in this world for a few decades, I have to say it is at least as likely that he was poisoned as it is that he wasn't. You can't say no. Poison him? They wouldn't do that. That would ah that strains credulity for me. So in my heart, I feel he was probably poisoned, right? Because he struck a blow at the heart of what was happening. It wasn't a superficial blow. And so anything to silence this guy would have been worth it, I would think, to at least some people, right? Everybody doesn't have to be able to commit murder. You just need one person who is depraved enough to do that. And I think it it sounds likely. It sounds likely. But the historical record leaves us unsure.
And we can also embrace the and. He may have been consumptive and he may have been poisoned.
That's also true. I didn't think of that one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We have two questions. So much of the appeal is written as a direct response to Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia. Do we know why the late Jefferson was so influential for Walker?
Well, influential has to be in inverted commas, I think. Um, of course, Jefferson is someone who, on paper, is a Democrat, at least a Republican. He he says that he thinks about the horrors of the sins of slavery, and he shudders. But he owns slaves, including his own children, and in the notes on the Virginia plantation, he says explicitly that black people are inferior to whites. He says this not by innuendo, but point blank and explicitly. Excuse me. So David Walker is saying, even the great poet of liberty thinks that you are inferior. And remember, this is his primary target, to uplift the kind of ontological um, assumptions that black people are making about themselves, that they deserve to be in slavery, that this is the natural order of things, and so forth. So I think it's important in the sense that he's able to kind of put an underscore of his point that we are men, and that even white men who want to be seen as your ally may not agree that you are their equal, even if they can write poetically about equality. It doesn't mean that they really believe it when it comes to you.
Another question asks, the appeal predated the Liberator. Did Walker's rhetoric push William Lloyd Garrison toward embracing a more radical position?
I believe it did, yes. I believe it did. I believe it did. Um, so, to Garrison's credit, he was not a person that could not be pushed. He was not a person that couldn't grow, right? So, this is one of the beautiful things about him, and what makes him such a powerful ally. But I do think that, unlike us, the bias against the importance of the appeal would not have been operational then, right? So black voices actually, I think, spoke loud in a way when you're talking about a movement that's been held on the behalf of people who are normally not given a voice. Then when they do have a voice, it's listened to, and we can see that Garrison did listen.
Yeah. I would love to invite anyone else who has questions to pop them into the chat right now. So I'd love for you to just, as we're starting to close, to talk about the legacy of David Walker and, how you see him fitting into the thought stream of America, and how someone who was so passionately influential was silenced so effectively in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm. Another excellent question. Um, well, let me start with the first part of the question. I believe that Walker's influence is very strong in at least two strains of Black political thought. Um, so the Harold Cruz, the great cultural critic, says that you can understand the political history of African Americans through the lenses of two schools, one of which is the nationalist school and the other is the integrationist school. So if Frederick Douglass is the great integrationist of his time, then David Walker would be the great nationalist of his time. In the sense, not in the sense of separation, but in the sense of his focus. Douglass is trying to convince white people of their shortcomings and of the evils of slavery. Walker is not trying to convince white people of anything, right? He refers to them when he's excoriating the lady for letting the slave catcher go. He's saying these people are your natural enemies. That's the type of language he used, right? So he was the fiery orator long before Malcolm X, long before Marcus Garvey. He was speaking emotionally. He was trying to make an emotional appeal to black folk who seemed to be asleep when it came to the, the exigencies of their freedom. That what it took to do it, they had to be shaken alive to rise to the action that was necessary, right? And so you do have people like that, but they tend to die young. They tend to die young. And so he's one of the first one of these people who said, I'll be damned. Even though I'm privileged, even though I can sit up here on Beacon Hill, you know, chilling, drinking coffee and tea in the morning, I'm going to risk it all because this is what I have been called to do. So there's a line to be drawn from him, I would say, to Marcus Garvey and then to Malcolm. But he differs from Marcus because Marcus, like, all of these uprisings are happening in the time of the Haitian Revolution. So there were black people who wanted to immigrate to Haiti. In fact, 6,000 did, right? There were black people who decided to be part of the American experiment of expatriation to Liberia, for instance, right? Lincoln wanted to send black people to Central America. You know, the citizenship debate that Walker is involved in before the 14th Amendment, before there's a legal definition of American citizenship, he is saying, we are citizens. We belong here. We are in a position to be self-determined. We are sailors. We are coopers. We are belt makers. We are horsemen. We are boatmen. We are agricultural producers. We make crafts. Like, we can exist. We don't need the benevolence and the paternalism of anyone, right? So this is a kind of fiery rhetoric that we still hear today. And I'm going to say the best of which, because sometimes it devolves into something that is less noble, but the best of it, I would say, is relevant in the sense that Malcolm X is relevant. That here you have someone who combined political activism with the kind of theoretical introspection into the psychology of black people, right? And who understood that people were oppressed not just by chains, but by ideas. And the willingness to combine ideas with action is what makes him such a singular person, right? And so you have somebody like a Martin Luther King, who I would say is in that And they go, although Martin Luther King eschewed violence, right? He wouldn't take it as far as David Walker was advocating, but we don't know. He died young too, and he was in a different historical set of circumstances. He wasn't around during chattel slavery. But what we can say is the courage to stand up and to urge Black people to take their destiny into their hands is one of the legacies of David Walker, I think. One of the legacies would be that. Um, what was the second half of your question? I'm sorry.
Well, I find it extraordinary that
Oh, why
you
was he
refer
silent?
to the silencing. Yes.
The
Yeah.
silencing. Um, well, I'm gonna say that all people, all Black nationalists have been silenced. The ones who get an audience. You can say anything you want to, but if you actually get a mass audience, then you become dangerous, right? So the next person, so the national leader was Frederick Douglass, right? He dies in 1895. Then it becomes Booker T. Washington. He's the national Black leader, right? He has these revolutionary ideas, but he wears the mask that grins and lies, and he has to have a certain type of compromise in his political strategies, right? Then you have Martin Luther King, who becomes the national spokesperson for African Americans, right? He moves away from civil rights. He starts contemplating how the North was different, right? He almost got killed in the North. And then he starts talking about poor people's right. He starts talking about American imperialism in Vietnam. And he's killed. Next thing you know, he dies young, right? Same thing with Malcolm X. He's a Black nationalist. He is not afraid to look white power in the eye and say, I have a principled stand against your organization, the way that you have organized society, right? And what happens? He dies young, right? So the first time we have this type of oratory, he dies young too, right? So how is it that he was silenced? The old-fashioned way. You kill him and you silence his ideas in terms of when you teach your children, what do you teach them? Do you teach them uh, that Black people had the right to kill for their freedom? No, you don't. You don't teach that. Whether it's David Walker saying it or Malcolm X saying it, you don't teach that. You don't teach that. Not in a society that propagates white supremacy, that is not willing to interrogate it in a rigorous fashion, right? So the thing is, and I hope I don't offend anyone here, but let me just put it like this: the story for me, the headlines is not that Donald Trump is a white supremacist, racist thug. The story for me is that half of the country loves him. Um, that to me is a more interesting story. Uh, so if 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 we live in a country that still has an ambivalent relationship to its Black citizens, then we live in a country that wants to curtail the rhetoric of Black citizens, right? So whether it's rap music or the blues or fiery preachers or breakaway religious groups, these things are always seen as being subversive, always seen as being dangerous, right? So it's interesting that the Black Panthers could be infiltrated by the FBI and people could be killed, right? The Nation of Islam could be infiltrated by the FBI and people could be killed, right? The civil rights movement could be infiltrated by the FBI and people are killed. But somehow the Ku Klux Klan is not silenced in any meaningful way, even though that there are people who infiltrate that organization. It wasn't attacked in the same way and with the same efficacy as black nationalist groups were, which were most people. If jail wasn't enough, then the bullets could finish the job, right? We think of Mike Clark and Fred Hampton, for instance, people who were not violent by any stretch of the imagination, but who were killed because of the ideas that they were standing for and the danger that was there because they were charismatic enough to make other people believe it too. And this is what David Walker had. He gave us a charismatic presentation of a political idea, right?
So I want to read a couple of comments, not questions, but comments.
Okay.
Dr. Walker thanks, Dr. Walker, Dr. Washington, thank you for tonight's ever so interesting discussion. You've given us so much to think about, to go back and study about, and to continue talking about. Another person added, thank you to you for a deep and sensitive perspective on this amazing man. I am so grateful to feel more of his presence and yours. And we have, for everyone in the chat, there's a link to the appeal, which you can read online. I encourage it. We have one last question, maybe for a brief answer. Can you discuss how we may have been influenced by Philadelphia's AME congregation? Was he influenced by it?
He was definitely influenced by Richard Allen's AME denomination as well as congregation. We think he did go to Philadelphia, but it's really the denomination that is the big story because you have all of these black religious kind of affiliates, African American affiliates to these other denominations, especially after the second wave of the Great Awakening. However, there start to be disputes about who could ordain people, who could attend services, which seating they can have. So in Philadelphia, it was really atrocious, right? Black people had to go up in the balcony and so forth. So Richard Allen is one of the seminal figures of this time period because he establishes an independent denomination. So one of the things that happens after the American Revolution, you told me to be brief. One of the things that happened after the American Revolution is that these black rebels are becoming more ideological, and they're using some of the rhetoric of the American Revolution, and they are organizing over larger regions of the land, and they are becoming confederate in the sense that there are linkages between these different territories. And so no one was more successful at this than the AME Church, right? And so Walker is a Methodist. He's a member of the, probably going all the way back to his time in Wilmington.
Well, I want to thank you personally. This has been fascinating and dynamic and really thought-provoking. And you've also, I think, primed us beautifully for the next talk, which will be diving into the language of the appeal to explore the way it's constructed and the, I guess, the rhetorical threads that trace through even to now.
Yes.
But mostly I do want to thank you for the benefit of your thinking and experience and your patience with us. So thank you so much.
I've enjoyed this. Thank you.
Okay. Well, have a good night, everybody. And I hope we'll see you next month for our next discussion. Take care now.